Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning for this session called Sovereignty for Sale. We're going to be looking at the casino scam operations that are very much being operated by transnational organized crime groups in Southeast Asia. We are very much concerned also about the resulting human trafficking and the illicit activities that are flowing on from this, very much on a grand scale, facilitated by corruption. The objective really is to unpack why and also how this is taking place. So the means, the methods, the facilitators of these special economic zones that were very much initially established with the view to attract foreign investment. And how is this really impacting not only nationally, but regionally and also globally? Also, probably you've heard of pig butchering, so we'll be getting into this as well. I'm Annika Wides. I am with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the team lead for the Anti-Corruption Hub based in Bangkok, covering Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I have a great panel with me here today, so let me introduce them. I'm going to get to ask them a few questions for about an hour, and then for half an hour, I will turn it over to the audience to ask questions. So let me start with Pushpin. Pushpin Muraya is Executive Director and Founding Committee Member of the Center to Combat Corruption and Cronyism, the C4 Center in Malaysia. He has over 20 years of experience in the corporate sector, working in various roles within the banking and in investment, but also, of course, in fighting corruption. Rebecca Miller is UNODC's Regional Coordinator on Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling. She covers Southeast Asia and the Pacific, based in Bangkok. Through her 20-plus years working on trafficking and smuggling, she's advised governments and been involved for a range of, and worked for a number of UN agencies, NGOs, and also think tanks. We have Bor Deng, who is the investigations team director with Radio Free Asia. She was previously with the BBC News in Washington, the Times of London, and has written extensively for The Economist, Slate, Politico, Washington Post, among others. We have Mesh Dara. He's an investigative journalist in Cambodia. He was the former reporter with the Cambodia Daily, Phnom Penh Post, and Voice of Democracy. Last year, he received the Hero Award by the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, for his reporting on the prevalence of cyber scam compounds in Cambodia linked to human trafficking, forest criminality, transnational organized crime, and corruption. So let me start with Pushpin. Pushpin, the special economic zones, they're indeed attracting a lot of foreign direct investment in our region, Southeast Asia, and many have argued that their establishment has been successful, created jobs, really bolstered economic growth. However, when we really look at the scam centers, the casinos, the transnational organized crime groups, human trafficking, other illicit activities, it all appears to converge around these special economic zones. Can you paint the picture for us, please?
Sure. Thank you, Annika, and good morning, everybody, for joining us today. So maybe I just want to quickly contextualize the SEZs, so we understand where we're talking from and what's the point of it. So actually, what are SEZs, or special economic zones? There are many names in it. One of the more common names is also known as free trade zones, where basically it works on a basis that the difference is in terms of size, in terms of boundaries. So they're basically similar items, similar concept, but in terms of size. So whatever we're speaking about, SEZ is basically encompassing most of it. Okay, that's the first thing. Now, second thing is SEZs are designed, importantly, as a legal mechanism to facilitate international trade and also to incentivize foreign investments. It's designed to make business much more easier. Now, there's about, I think, 5,000 SEZs around the world. Now, they achieve this by reducing supervision, better tax incentives, tariffs, reduced bureaucratic procedures, faster setup, and a bit more liberal approach in application of laws. The hope is that actually to encourage spillover effects, as you mentioned earlier, job opportunities, higher wages, housing, economic prosperity in the region, But again, they are all not successful. And the economic benefit has also been mixed. Yeah. Now, there are two types of SEZs you need to be aware of. One is publicly owned, and the one is privately owned. So the key takeaway in a nutshell, SEZ basically is it's a designated region where it can build its own port, cities governed by a private entity, and usually power is decentralized into either private entity or localities. Now, in order to make SEZs successful, you have a few components. One is the investments to ensure infrastructure is there, modern technology, powerful internet connection, and also reliable power supply. Now, all this sounds really good, in terms of investments. But what is the problem? The same conditions that is meant to encourage by above-board corporations to invest also allow undesirable elements to take advantage, leading to infiltration of criminal activities. Now, this again is encouraged by, first, lack of regulated framework. There are no labor rights, no unions allowed to be formed. Governance structures are in favor of corporations, limited supervision, and corruption is within the whole structure. It's also practicing the licensing regime and also enforcement agencies. Let me give you two examples how SEZs can attract criminal elements. In China, 2017, China banned ivory trade and a few other wildlife items. So we had traders and poachers working in China itself or operating in China itself. When the law came into effect, what happened was these traders and poachers actually moved their operations to a lesser, more regulated SEZs in Vietnam, Myanmar, and Cambodia. So that lax environment allowed criminals to come and invest in this particular area. Second example, after the pandemic, COVID-19, Macau actually went after a lot of gambling, online gambling operators. What has happened since, because of the crackdown, many of them have moved their operations to Cambodia, where in 2022, close to about 107 to 174 increase in spike in illegal operators in Cambodia itself. Whereas Macau, the number decreased from 45 to 30. So in other words, when you crack down in one area, they look for spaces where there is lack of authority, lesser framework, and they move their operations to. This is where SEZs become important for them. So now this is where legitimate companies running other businesses like scam operations, investment schemes, online gambling, money laundering, illegal banking are all set up in SEZs. Now, one of the biggest movers of illicit monies are the online gambling platform, which allows for cross-border exit and entry. What this means is that basically you can put in money in one jurisdiction and take out the money in another jurisdiction, making it as clean money. Now, some SEZs are also privately owned, as I mentioned earlier. For example, the Golden Triangle SEZ, located in Lao Bako province. This is a joint venture between the Lao government and a private casino operator. Now, this entity that operates the casino in the SEZ has also been sanctioned by the US government for drug trafficking, human trafficking, laundering, and wildlife trafficking. Now, what is interesting is that this setup is that this SEZ is owned majority by the private operator, whereas the government only owns close to perhaps 20%. So that is an interesting point to pick out in terms of ownership of SEZ as well. Now, this leads to another issue, which is a complete capture of government policies, where investments and financings are facilitated by elements of criminal activity or corporate sector, where they contribute to the development, investment, and infrastructure of regional development, and they also create employment, which is actually the obligation of the government. So they help ease the government's obligations by actually putting in investments. Then you have another component. This leads to a component where they must be looked at in terms of political power play and nexus between criminals, elements within the SEZ. We need to deeper understand ourselves in terms of the political connection between criminal elements and how they play a role with the politicians setting up SEZs. This is very important in terms of because there's so many linkages there as well. So my last point, just to get the context of what SEZs is about, some privately owned SEZs even have their own militia, their own control mechanism, their own enforcement agencies. And they're not subject to any law of the land. There's no accountability, there's little accountability. And I'm sure many of you have heard about this in terms of Myanmar, but I think the problem goes beyond Myanmar, more into the region as well. Now, this is what we mean why there is where sovereignty is left for sale. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Pushpin. Rebecca, kind of drawing on exactly that point, what's the current stance? And also to link really and build a little bit more on the special economic zones and the transnational organized crime element.
Yeah, so just to build on what Pushpin has said, in recent years, the number of special economic zones and casinos in the lower Mekong subregion have simply exploded. And UNODC in 2021 actually did some research, and we estimated that there were 340 licensed or unlicensed casinos in the region and 128 special economic zones that were either in operation or under construction. And now that we're 2024, we're much, 3 years on, we know that these numbers are even bigger than that. But coupled with this is the fact that Southeast Asia, and again, particularly the Mekong, is also known for its long history of powerful organized crime groups and non-state armed groups, as Pushpin's been talking about, which exert de facto control in certain territories. Again, this is very much the case in Myanmar, but again, unfortunately, we are seeing the spread of this. And these groups have invested heavily in casinos and special economic zones where money laundering and other illicit activities are taking place. So, however, there are several important reasons why transnational organized crime groups have rapidly increased the operation into online frauds and scams, driving what we're calling human trafficking for forced criminality, and happy to unpack that later if needed, since the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people said, oh, this is just because of COVID. COVID was only really one factor in relation to this. And the first reason is that essentially COVID brought to the rapid halt all the ambitions of transnational organized crime groups to basically attract millions of gamblers and tourists from China and Southeast Asia to the casinos and special economic zones of the Mekong region, as well as the POGOs, the Philippines offshore gaming operators, as they were called. And so this was a huge factor. So strict lockdowns and border controls basically meant that gamblers could no longer travel freely to Cambodia, to Laos, to Myanmar, to the Philippines. And as a result, organized crime groups' need for revenue, new sources of revenue, essentially intensified. The second reason is that in 2021, the government of China encouraged its nationals that were living or traveling and working overseas, particularly in Southeast Asia, to return home or face very strict penalties. So this created actually a major labor gap, which organized crime groups rapidly needed to address. The third reason is during the pandemic, we saw the rise of and popularity of digital payments, e-commerce apps, and cryptocurrencies, as we were all spending more time at home and online. And this created an important market for organized crime groups to invest in. The fourth reason is during the pandemic, we actually saw significant negative effects on the ability of law enforcement to investigate crime. So the travel and investigative limitations imposed in response to the pandemic, combined with the remote locations of some of these special economic zones and casinos, as well as the impunity that was being offered and afforded to offenders due to their relationships with corrupt government officials, essentially meant that criminal organized crime groups could expand with very little scrutiny. So in response to all of these challenges, organized crime groups identified opportunities to develop new revenue streams by committing online scams and fraud, and targeting people from Asia, North America, Europe, Australia, basically everyone around the world. And organized crime groups also understood that they basically could address their new labor needs, and I put that in brackets, because we're not actually talking about labor. We're talking about people who are being trafficked and forced to commit crimes. They could fill these, sort of new needs by trafficking young, educated, media savvy, multilingual people from Asia and beyond into various scam compounds. So these casinos, hotels, buildings that are owned by shell companies, where they basically could be confined and forced to carry out scams.
Rebecca, I think a lot of the attraction that has really been garnered is through the human face of everything. Yeah. And you already touched on the targeting of humans. Can you elaborate firstly on what is really happening in these compounds? And then also you touched on human trafficking. Unpack that a little bit more for us. And I think we're also very curious to know the nexus between the human trafficking and corruption.
Yeah. So over the last couple of years, we've seen, there are many estimates out there, but tens of thousands of people, predominantly it started from Southeast Asia, but now we're seeing individuals from South Asia, from countries as far away as Africa, South America, even the US has reported some citizens basically being trafficked into these compounds, held against their will, and forced to operate sophisticated cyber scams. And exploited workers have been telling all of us that essentially they're confined to these complexes by organized crime groups. And they're essentially tortured if they try to escape, or they don't even meet their quotas. They all have quotas that they must fulfill on a daily basis. And these individuals are experiencing basically horrific treatment. And again, just talking about the scope and scale of this, we did some research last year in September 2023, and we, at that time, estimated over 40 nationalities of people who had been trafficked from all around the world into these scam operations in Southeast Asia. So how does all of this start? Well, recruitment basically starts through social media platforms. Telegram, Facebook, WeChat, WhatsApp, you name the platform. There's probably some form of what looks like a legitimate ad being advertised on these platforms. And individuals are being targeted for specific skill sets. So again, multilingual, IT backgrounds, human resources background, and they actually go through several stages of an interview process. So they really do believe that they're applying for a legitimate job. But once they're in these compounds, victims are beaten, they're drugged, they're electrocuted, they're tortured, and they're abused psychologically. How do they get out? Well, victims typically have to pay a ransom, or they have to recruit others into the scam compounds in order to gain their freedom. And those who actually cannot recruit others or pay a ransom are essentially resold on to other compounds, which ends up doubling or tripling the profits of these organized crime groups. The other point I want to make is that this is not just unique to Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines. We are seeing these scam operations mushrooming across the region. And similar scam compounds have emerged in Thailand and Vietnam, even Malaysia. But to be honest, these are typically shut down pretty quickly for a range of reasons. But really, we've seen this in more organized crime groups getting into these operations. The Yakuza is seeing how much money is being made, and we can talk about that later. The Philippines offshore gambling operators, the POGOs, they've seen some raids where they've rescued over 2,000 alleged victims of trafficking in one compound. And again, these people are from all across the globe. Just quickly on the corruption angle, of course, like any business, criminal networks are seeking out enabling environments. And we know, unfortunately, in the Southeast Asia region, we have porous borders, weak rule of law, lacking cooperation across borders, and of course, corruption challenges, which are essentially key enabling factors for all of this to take place. And of course, very much of this is linked to corruption. Transnational organized crime groups basically across the Southeast Asia region have formed and developed alliances with very powerful government figures and also the private sector with the intent of expanding their wealth and power, and they're subsequently leveraging their relationships with these officials in order for this to take place. Just to give one quick example before I stop, we know, for example, that national immigration and police agencies are also involved in this. They've been identified as facilitating the illegal entry of victims of trafficking to two destination countries. They've been facilitating fraudulent visa stamps in victims' passports, ensuring, of course, the safe operation of these scam operations. Very few of them are shut down, or they're temporarily shut down and then they shift elsewhere and then they reopen. And of course, we've also seen where officials have basically been freeing victims from immigration detention to basically return them back to organized crime groups and back to the compounds themselves.
Thanks, Rebecca. Dar, can I turn to you as somebody who is on the ground, has led a lot of the investigations into Cambodia's, scam compounds, be it in Phnom Penh or the coastal village or town of Chinookville. Yep. You very much focused on forced criminality and human trafficking. What would really be 3 points based on your reporting that you would wish to share with the audience?
So to start with, I really would like to thank UNODC for inviting me here and give me a chance to be in Europe again. And Rebecca worked very hard to get my visa because her little knee doesn't have embassy in Cambodia, but she done the impossible work to get me to come here to share my personal experience in here. So I have been walking a long way doing reporting on this, and also just a little bit personal experience. I have worked, as you have mentioned, I have worked with 3 institutions, and these 3 institutions have been not really in well. And plus, I get a word. I also get another side of the words in my country from a top leader. So I have been getting, last year, I had a lot of titles like a rubbish journalist, a psycho journalist, a pump it out of Western, and national destruction. So there are a lot of backlash for the one who try to dig up into this syndication. So, and plus I also had been, last year, I also have been arrested for going down to Sihanouk and calling while the police raiding the area, they try to take 200 or 300 Vietnam out of the compound. So I went there, I take the picture, and then they said, why you come here? And then they just order the police to arrest me in there. So there's a lot of consequence too. And let's switch very quickly to like Rebecca had mentioned about this kind of crime. So we can look into more deeply. Like I have been covering, like there is Telegram group, many Telegram group that in the Telegram group there is like you can see the advertise, you can see everything. You can see smuggling of weapon, prostitution, wildlife, trafficking, and also selling people. So like in the Telegram group, you can see like, not like, oh, we have Sri Indian, we have Bangladesh, what age they are, they can typing, and then the price, and then here, drop the ping, the location. So like, I think also since the advance of the technology is also very helpful, especially the AI tech now, very, very helpful to for this criminal network too. And yep, so I give you some example that in order to link from Cambodia to the world. So 2022, there is the police come to rescue 3 foreigners, including one is U.S. citizenship, and another one is Cambodian and U.S. citizenship, and another Indonesian woman. So you can see like even far away from my country, from the U.S., from Europe, also flying to Cambodia to do this kind of scamming. Why? So this is, we need to answer the question why they dare to go from Cambodia, to come from US, from Europe, to go to Cambodia, to go to Laos, to go to Myanmar, and Philippines and other part. Why? And a couple more example. Also, the place that they recruit the U.S. citizen. Just in May, a couple of weeks ago, there is a about 60 Indian who have been protested, and then quickly police come and take them out, and then the Indian embassy said it's a scam, but the Cambodia authority cop in Sihanouk said it is a legitimate casino. So you can see the different way of interpretation, and mostly in the past year we have seen they said it is a labor dispute, not like slavery, confinement. It is mostly labor dispute. And also I also met a Cambodian scammer who when I went to research, and then I like have a room next to him, and then we accidentally talking, and he said like in 1 month, if we do not make 1 million, we're going to bankrupt. So we need to make 1 million, and there is Turkish. So that's why there is torturing, there is electric shock, or kidnapping and killing. So because this is the high stake, and also this brings us to see that he also add that the amount of the thing that he did is to meet the demand, and he said the U.S. easy to scam the U.S. people than to scam the European people, because the U.S. much more falling to the beautiful. So you message them, and then they will reply back quickly. And while you message the European, just fuck out, something like that. So there is no risk much. So you can see like how much the US lost the money and how much the European lost the money. You can compare to that. And also I also met many countless survival. And I think the survival, when the God on their side, they can survive. But if the God not exist on that day, they will die terribly. And we also like 2022, I and my colleague went to Cambodia to recruit one Chinese very young man. He messaged us asking for help, and he just posting on his Facebook that like he was tricked into the scam and forced to do the scam. If he do not do the scam, they will electric hit with the stick and would be die. And then he posted it on the PM Facebook. And then later on, we have him out of the compound. Yes, we surely have him, but he have to be in the immigration center for 3, 6 months or 1 year for fake news. So you can see like the people cannot escape. They have to suffer the consequence too for the victimized. Wrong classification here. And lastly, I also cover one story. It is three Thai who have been working in one compound like for 3 years without getting paid. And then he have been sent to another compound. While on the way to another compound, while the driver pissing, he tried to drive the car away in order to get into Thailand. But the police stopped him on the way, arrested him, charged him for stealing the car, and then illegal crossing border. And when the police know that they were not getting paid, you can see like, this is how the horrible they have to facing. So like they are victims, but they still have to suffer a double tragedy for them. Whether I still have time or we run out of time.
We'll come back with a few more questions, but thank you. Bor, globally there has been extensive reporting on pig butchering. Can you unpack that for us? And also to Dara's comment, how are the scam centers really linked to people being defrauded, for example, in the US? I think was the point that Dara's
Yeah,
video.
absolutely. And I have to say, I'm so lucky to be on this panel, and especially with Dara, who's worked with some of our reporters. So I don't know about people in this audience, but I often get very random text messages or WhatsApp messages that are quite innocuous seeming in both English and in Chinese.
Yeah.
I'm a Mandarin speaker, and it'll be something very innocuous like, hello, how are you? Or oftentimes the messages I get in Mandarin are something like, oh, long time no see, I'm your old classmate, whatever it is. Very sort of innocuous messages. And as Pushpen and Rebecca have already alluded to, the thing is oftentimes those messages are being sent by people who are being forced to scam in these, often originating in Southeast Asia, trying to get me to answer them. So this is the start of what's been called the pig butchering scam. It comes from the Chinese 杀猪盘, which the notion is that you're fattening up a pig until you're ready to butcher them as much as possible. And in this case, the victim, or the would-be victim, me or whoever is receiving these messages and hopefully answering them, is the so-called pig. And it's these schemes are can be quite sophisticated. Even with the example that I give, they know that I'm a Chinese speaker. They know that one of the things that's quite common is for, people in the diaspora to connect and over, being students or having some sort of connection. And the goal is to establish a relationship that goes on for some time so that you establish a level of trust, a level of intimacy oftentimes, and a level of sort of psychological connection to get the person on the other end to eventually, usually, invest. And these calls for investment can also be quite sophisticated. You're not asked to explicitly invest in something, but you're sort of casually told, oh, I've been doing some cryptocurrency trading and it's really great, and it's this exchange, and you're led to this exchange that seems quite legitimate. So as Rebecca had alluded to earlier, the level of sophistication is part of it. And eventually, you invest more and more money into what seems like a legitimate exchange or a legitimate investment until suddenly, when you've made enough money and you want to get out, you're not able to withdraw these funds. And that's the sort of butchering of the pig. And I think the really insidious and sinister part of it is the level of, as I mentioned, sort of psychological connection that you have. Oftentimes, the victims are people who know what they're doing, who are educated, who come from all over the world, as we've talked about. And they're really, it's sort of the other end of this double tragedy, right? You've got the person who's doing this scamming, who's gone through this horrible experience, who's being forced to do this for 16 hours a day. And then you've got the person on the other end who is also a victim. And the way that these victims are sort of selected can be, it can be, people who are lonely, people who are vulnerable, people who think they're very good with money and yet fall for these kinds of tricks. I think the stories that are quite surprising are, Dara alluded to how Americans are allegedly more falling to these schemes than others. We laugh about it, but actually they can be quite serious. There was a story that my former colleagues at the BBC did a few years ago of a woman in Boston who was defrauded, and she was a widow and she had cancer, and the person at the other end who had defrauded her was a person who had been trafficked to a Cambodian compound. The way that this person got her to invest all this money was saying, look, don't you want to leave money for your kids? And it's an incredibly sad story because she had been diagnosed with an illness at the time, and sort of this person had touched on her most sort of vulnerable thoughts. And the level of sophistication, as Dara mentioned with AI, also goes on the other end, right? This person who had been defrauding her actually went on a phone call with her, and actually there was an AI-generated person on the other end of the line. So just the level of sophistication and broadness of the scheme is quite quite terrifying in some ways. And then on the other end, it isn't just people, it's really a global phenomenon. It isn't just people who have money, who are in the West, who are sort of vulnerable and you can steal lots of money from them. It's also people who are in the region. A story that we did about this time last year was about these teenagers from Laos who had been trafficked to the border region in Myanmar, where, as we kind of alluded to, a great deal of political turmoil and lack of governance because of the conflict that's going on there has made the proliferation of these scam compounds really common. And in this case, these Lao teenagers were trafficked from their home 200 miles south to the Myanmar Thai border, and they were scamming Thais, just local Thais on the other side, pretending to be lonely hearts, trying to get them in a relationship and defrauding them that way. And in this case, it was not a very sophisticated scheme, right? Like these teenagers, it's almost terrifying. They just got a message on WhatsApp or Facebook saying, hey, do you want to make some money in the Golden Triangle? There's lots of casinos, there's lots of opportunities. And they say, yeah, sure, I'll come along. Next thing they know, they're being trafficked further down south to another SEZ. Because Laos is similar to Thai, they were being taken there for that specific reason, because they would have the ability to trick these particular victims. So I think the broadness, the insidiousness, the proliferation of these kinds of schemes is kind of, I think, one of the reasons why maybe many people have heard of big pig butchering. Many people might even unknowingly be sort of hoped for victims of it themselves.
Yeah. Thank you, Bor. Rebecca, can I go to something that you mentioned before? You did unpack for us kind of the link between corruption and human trafficking. Yeah. To take that another step further, UNODC published a report in January this year, and that was on the casinos, money laundering, underground banking, and transnational organized crime. It was called that hidden and accelerating threat in Southeast Asia. What kind of profits are we really talking about, and how is the money or the illicit finance really flowing?
So we're talking about billions in dollars of profits. In terms of the organized crime groups, their profits absolutely have reached unprecedented levels. And illicit money is increasingly flowing through the regional casino industry and other large cash flow businesses, including through the use of cryptocurrencies that we have seen. But of course, that is not just about cryptocurrencies. It's multiple factors, which I'll unpack in a moment. But just to, as part of our research into how much money the scam industry is actually earning, this is actually rivaling some countries' gross domestic product, their GDPs. So to give one example, UNODC's research looked at one country in Southeast Asia, and we gave a low estimate of profit from the scam compounds as $7.5 to $12.5 billion in raw earnings in 1 year. And this is actually half of that country's GDP. So I think that gives an indication of what we're talking about in relation to the scope and scale of this. And as Boris pointed out, a lot of this is being reinvested into AI and other technologies in relation to the scams. But in addition to this, our report found that casinos and junkets represent a critical piece of the underground banking and money laundering infrastructure. And this is serving the needs of transnational organized crime groups who are operating regionally as well as globally. The money isn't just staying in Southeast Asia. It's going all around the globe. And while casinos and junkets have certainly, for years been serving as vehicles for underground banking and money laundering, the proliferation of the online gaming platforms, the e-junkets, and both illegal and unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges in Southeast Asia has simply changed the game. And this is allowing for faster and anonymized movement of funds. And so casinos and related businesses have proven both capable and efficient in moving and laundering massive volumes of cash, as well as cryptocurrencies, largely undetected. And this is creating channels for effectively integrating billions of dollars in criminal proceeds into our formal financial systems. But specifically, just to go back to one point, underpinning transnational organized crime groups in the region are sophisticated and increasingly diversified underground banking systems. And underground banking basically refers to activities that run parallel to or operate outside of formal banking systems, commonly in the form of informal value transfers. And these informal value transfer systems involve dealers who basically facilitate the transfer of value to third parties in other jurisdictions without actually having to move these items physically. So in Southeast Asia, this has increasingly involved the use of unregulated and illegal casino operations. And the final settlement between brokers occurs through the exchange of cash, cryptocurrencies, real estate, trade, or by other means. But I think the last point I want to make about this is really concerningly, as law enforcement and regulators have stepped up their efforts against casinos, illegal online gambling, the cyber fraud and scam compounds in Southeast Asia, organized crime groups basically are migrating and shifting their operations into these more inaccessible and autonomous armed group territories, as we've been talking about in Myanmar as a perfect example, but also other pockets of criminality in the lower Mekong subregion. And what we fear, certainly, and what we have seen is that ongoing pressure from all of us, from law enforcement, is likely just going to motivate these organized crime groups to innovate and move further into the shadows and into territories which remain a bit untouchable.
Or can I ask you to reflect on that? Because you have a global perspective, and I think very curious because it's not just about Southeast Asia. The tentacles have gone everywhere.
Right, yeah, and I think also to Pushpin's point earlier, there's sort of this marriage of the legitimate and government end of it and the sort of criminal and illicit end of it. A really big report that our reporter Jack Davies did for Radio Free Asia looked into a really one of the largest conglomerates in Cambodia, the Prince Group. And our reporting found a really good example of what Rebecca is talking about, right? So we found evidence that this group owns a compound in Cambodia where locals have spotted people being beaten back. We're told that there's a scam operation going on. They claim, they don't know what's going on. They have plausible deniability. But the interesting thing is that Prince Group, it's a huge conglomerate that operates in pretty much every area in Cambodia, from real estate to gambling to infrastructure and banking, and there is very much a legal seeming end to it, right? Like it's a very well-known company. The thing is, what we found was evidence that they were registering these companies under different names, and they were one of which was a online gambling on online games. And sources told us actually these online games were fictitious, and they were used as cover to move the money that Rebecca is talking about. So it looks like they're making money off of these fictitious games, but really nobody's actually playing them. It's just a cover for using untraditional banking methods. So, remittance agencies, like in the West, we would have like Western Union, but, for a version of that to transfer these monies. And the really interesting thing too is that the companies that it's moving money to are registered in places like the Isle of Man or in Singapore. The people who head these companies are not people who are linked to Prince Group. There's somebody that they've hired to represent them as the CEO or the administrator or what have you. But through these sort of obfuscations and different registries and going in different jurisdictions, it's a way to, it certainly looks like a way to launder this money. I'm not allowed to say that they were laundering money because they have denied it, but certainly experts have told us that this is, a very clear example of how somebody might go about doing this. And I think that the difficult thing is, obviously we looked at one company. There are many, many other examples certainly to be found. And just going through the sort of complex web of who's registered to whom, under what name, and what jurisdiction is one of the really big challenges I'm sure that UNODC and Pushpin finds in all of these.
Thank you. I mean, the whole beneficial ownership transparency is something that there's a big focus on at the moment, which is good. And that kind of goes to my next set of questions. You've painted a pretty grim picture. So to think about some of the solutions, maybe I can start with Rebecca. What do you think some actions are that governments can take, even at the ASEAN level, in really addressing this?
I think the first point I want to make before I go into some solutions is that we need to remember that human trafficking is just one form of transnational crime that we're seeing. All of this is intertwined with cybercrime, fraud, money laundering, extortion, and of course, corruption. And so this polycriminality really has created a lot of challenges for governments in the Mekong subregion, Southeast Asia, but also beyond. So really, there is an urgent need. As we've talked about the money flows, we've talked about the victims who are coming from all around the globe. We really do need regional cooperation, which again, of course, is easier said than done. If we're really going to address this form of transnational crime threats, which has become increasingly integrated and interlinked across Southeast Asia, but also with other regions of the world. So addressing this by one or just a few countries alone, and particularly just from a national perspective, because we have seen some of that, that's all well and good, but again, certainly we're not going to be dismantling these organized crime groups, which basically have their tentacles all around the world. And really, we're not going to be, shutting down their infrastructure, their operations, which again, as Boris said, are very much legitimized now. We are talking about a mix of listed businesses with illicit businesses. And this is, again, creating challenges for governments. So one of the things UNODC did last year was in June, we actually brought the ASEAN countries together with China to actually see if we could develop a strategic regional plan to respond. This high-level dialogue, which was co-chaired by the government of the Philippines and UNODC, did actually result in a strategic roadmap, which is very exciting, in response to this polycriminality. So it's not just about human trafficking, it's capturing all of the elements that we need to address in terms of what we're seeing to dismantle these organized crime groups. So we're quite excited about this. The Philippines has also decided that they're going to try and embed this within the ASEAN structure. Again, going to your point of what can we do as a region. So they're going to be tabling this at the next senior officials meeting on transnational organized crime, also called the SOMTC, to hope to get some traction in relation to this. But beyond that, we are looking at how we can work with governments and support governments across the region to respond to this, not just at a national level, but a regional and global level as well. But again, governments are only one part of all of this response.
So let me then turn maybe to Dara, from like a journalist perspective. What do you think needs to be done? What should the focus be?
So I think the focus is need to be I can give you an example lately. It's very good example. It's very excellent example to elaborate this. How can we cannot eliminate it, but we can reduce the scale of it. So a couple, I think this month, there is a Chinese man and a Cambodian woman have been arrested for scamming 8 people, including the U.S. citizen, including the Norway, including the Australia, including the Singapore, including the Thailand. And in order to make the case move, they have to loan the money, because they run out of money for the scam the first time. They have double scam again, like to the other people, and then now they have to borrow other people money to get the money to ask the lawyer to move the case. And then the case exactly moved. So this case has been helped by the GASO. So we can see that this is a very good example. Like we need the NGO or a company with the power and with the money to help the victim, whether victim including victim out of human trafficking or victim out the one who have been scammed through losing the money. So when we give them the money, when we give them the support, they can challenge with the creator and criminal. So like the case, so you can see they can bring the both couple who have been scammed them over 4 million or 5 million to the prison. So we can see the end result. So we also like, so far, we walk all the line that they draw for us. So we need to draw the line that we can walk to stop them. So we have ability to do it. It just matter whether we're willing to do it. Although we have seen that there is a UNODC global initiative. We have seen the amnesty. We have seen many NGOs who are start to jumping to do this, but it is not enough. So we need to put more fund, more cash into this. For me, like I lost my job, and I have nowhere and do not where to start to. So also the space for media is very narrow. I have to fight with my friend to put my article locally, regionally, or globally, because there is a lot of competition and collab of Vice News too. So Vice News used to cover a lot of crime in Cambodia, but they gone. So it's very hard to update the information how much it scale in the region also. So so I think through this, I also sometimes use my money from the research to cover the cost for the covering the story, because the money for covering the story is very little. And first, you compete with your friend. Secondly, you also like facing the harassment when you go into the field with the local authority for the guard at the compound, anything you can face. And then when your story already published, you face the third one is that slap shoot. After the article published, they can sue you. I have seen the international media, regional media who have been targeted, and then they have to, sometimes they have to extract the article because of the powerful capital. If you do not remove your article, we will sue you. And there is still a court case. So like, yeah, there is our neck is hanging there. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dara. I think that the livelihood, the protection, the space, but also the networking is just a profound issue that we need to really, I think this is why many of us are actually here at this conference, to know that you're not alone and that nobody's alone in all of this. Let me now jump to Bor. What do you think are really some of the solutions going forwards?
Yeah, I wanted to follow on to what Dara was saying, about the difficulty of getting these stories published. And I think one of the reasons why, besides just the terrible state of free speech in many places in Southeast Asia, is this is actually a case where public awareness is actually incredibly helpful, right? Like the more people know both that this can happen and you can be trafficked and that you can be a victim of trafficking, the less likely it is to happen. So, everyone go home, tell 10 friends, like don't answer any strange messages on WhatsApp or what have you. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why reporting actually is an incredibly important public awareness. Reporting journalism is actually an incredibly important part of the solution to this. I think it's anytime you've got sort of cash for sovereignty, as the title of this talk is, it's quite problematic. As Dara and Rebecca and Pushkar know, oftentimes you've got people who, especially in Cambodia, for example, if you invest a certain amount of money, you're able to buy your citizenship and become a Cambodian citizen. And we've seen this happen with many Chinese nationals. And anytime you're able to buy that kind of influence, it's not easy to sort of have the same kind of oversight and governance over those people. So I think awareness, understanding that these kinds of structures, which are prevalent in Southeast Asia, and which, from the reporting that we've all done, the research and reporting, seems to be something that many criminal groups, Chinese ones in particular in the research that we've done, but also increasingly other places, it's a way to elude governance. And the last thing is, we also in the West sort of have to look at ourselves and kind of what we alluded to earlier about how we support this structure of obfuscation and allowing these kinds of monies to wash together, whether it's our investments or support for things like SEZs, which may not be such a good idea, or the way that we allow registries of random companies that we don't really understand in jurisdictions that don't really have any kinds of governments over them. And also just as a journalist, the lack of transparency for many of these places, right? Like I can't get any business records to who's doing what in an SEZ, as some of these places are really difficult even to access. It's somewhere in the middle of the Mekong in Laos, on the border, like who knows? There's not a company's house that I can go and look up registries to for companies in Myanmar or Cambodia that easily. And how we might kind of have global structures that would support a better standardization, a better understanding of the importance of these things, a better understanding of maybe all being on the same page about this is both important for reporting the stuff so we all understand what's going on, and also for on the sort of structural end, figuring out a solution.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I like the way that you're looking very proactively and not reactively. I think in the past there has been a lot of reaction to what's going on. And last but not least, Pushpin, what do you think needs to be done now, also very much from a CSO perspective?
Sure. I think we have discussed a lot of related areas, but I just want to come back to the conversation of the SEZ itself. I want to give you an example of what's happening in Malaysia and how it could go wrong if there's no framework in place. There are plans to come up with Johor, Singapore Special Economic Zone. Now, there was a podcast by a major bank institution that actually mentioned that one of the bigger beneficiaries of this SEZ will be actually a casino and resort operator. So you also want to be very careful that if there's no framework, similar things happening in Mekong region can also be extended here as well. Now, the other thing also, they also mentioned that one of the other beneficiaries are also a very big developer who has got major ties with political parties and politicians. So how do we also ensure that there is no developmental corruption in terms of building SEZs and how they don't profiteer or they don't get access to lucrative contracts? So this is an example of why SEZ is still important for us to have a framework to make sure that they don't abuse it. Another point of concern is the sheer size of the proposed plan is equal to 4 times of Singapore. So that gives you an idea how do you actually want to look at monitoring, whatever laws you want to put in place. Now, a lot of policymakers think that SES is good for rapid industrialization, but then many times it failed. You don't see very good examples. Even Malaysia itself, there are many SEZs that actually failed. It's not doing very well. So, looking at all these contexts, we have even currently cases where Singapore has shut down a few of the scam centers in Singapore. I think they arrested about 10 foreign nationals last year. And even Malaysia has a lot of those scam centers which are shut down. Now, if we have a special zone in Malaysia in there itself, if it's not regulated properly, what's stopping them to actually come and set up operations in that particular area? So that's important. That's what I mean. You mentioned about preventive action against, always going after. So I think from CSO point of, there are a few points from me, as usual. CSO has got a lot of points to talk about. But in terms of that, we feel that there have to be oversight and regulatory overreach in terms of SEZs. Okay. First important point, there should not be any privately owned SEZs. That's important. It must be fully publicly managed, and also it should not be through public-private financing and all that kind of mechanisms. Now, EU provides a very good framework for SEZs. I think we should adopt that as well. Then we also have to administer strict anti-corruption measures and compliance on all parties that are coming into the SEZs. So you put frameworks in place for them to comply with. Next, we also have to ensure in terms of operational wise, all transactions should be digitized and the reduction of cash to prevent bribery and not the simplified issues. And also there must exist a database of information that can be accessed by enforcement agencies. Now, again, we mentioned about this before. We also look at administering beneficial ownership transparency to mitigate the participation of criminal elements within the SEZ. Now, another key information is we also need to have access of information for any activities or projects done within the SEZs. You don't want them to be excluded in terms of that. Now, in terms of increasing training awareness for enforcement agencies, there is a higher need to actually understand how online gambling platform works, cyber fraud works, and money laundering is conducted in order to effectively combat the activity. And also, I think we mentioned earlier, there will be a lot of collaborative action and capacity building in trying to regionally understand the whole scope of the entire issue. Then, legislative policy, comprehensive strategy in trying to deal with organized crime nationally as well, and underground banking, money laundering activities in this platform. Again, beneficial ownership must also extend to politically exposed people as well. Now, I think the more important mention, I think you mentioned this about the regional collaboration. Of course, there has to be inter-agency forums to share information, new criminal activities, actors, method, and look forward thinking. Now, I also want to mention why we have to look forward in terms of preventive measures. There is a new mechanism looking at metaverse. How do you manage crimes conducted in that universe? So we need to think ahead, how do you have a framework in place to manage that kind of engagement where people are not involved directly? It's within a different universe. So I think that's another example of preventive mechanisms. Now, even among CSOs, us regionally, we have a big role to play. We have a few of us form together a small, at this point in time, South Asia network. It's called the Asian Anti-Corruption Network for CSOs. And another one, Dara is involved as well, which is the Journalists Against Corruption Network. Now, CSOs do play a significant role in combating corruption. And through these collaborations, we are hoping to build a much better mechanism and coalition that's able to readily respond to growing threat. Now, again, we cannot continue to play catch-up every now and then with criminal activities and stuff like that. So we also feel that CSO are in a space that most enforcement agencies are absent due to a trust deficit between victims, the public, and also enforcement agencies. And we can actually play a role or bridge that gap. Now, I do feel that there is, as what Dara mentioned, there's need more support from everyone, and any form of support is actually welcome. Funding, that I've mentioned, ideas, experiences, contributing of research, resources, person. All these are actually important for us to actually make an impact in terms of fighting against corruption. So that will be some of the things I was thinking about. Yeah.
Did somebody take note of all of these? Thank you very much. And I think now it's a bit of a chance to hand it over to the audience. I know it's a lot to unpack, the first session of the conference. I would suggest I'll take 3 questions to start with. Could you mention your name, the organization you're with, and if you want the question to be targeted at any one panelist? Who would like? Yes, we've got one here, one there, and one there. Okay, please.
Hi everyone, my name's Clancy Moore. I work for Transparency International Australia. We've conducted some research looking at inflows from Cambodia and are very concerned around the prevalence of SEZs in the region, also the involvement of some Australians, particularly in the Shui Cocoa SEZ on the border of Thailand and Myanmar. Thank you, Dara, for the work that you do. I know that the context is very, very dangerous in Cambodia, so thank you. And also thank you, Bor, for mentioning the Prince Group. We know that the Prince Group arguably has very strong links with the ruling family in Cambodia, which brings me to my third question. We focus on primarily Australian policymakers. So what's the role and what are the policy solutions for governments like Australia or the UK or the US that are often the victims of scams, or the locations for the drugs that are smuggled out of the Golden Triangle, as an example, where you have governments in Southeast Asia either tacitly or directly involved in a lot of these scam centres. And often it's easier for a government like Australia to say, it's okay, we won't intervene, we don't want to ruin or impact our relationship, for example, with a government like Cambodia. So what are the policy solutions that governments like Australia can be thinking of? And my question is directed to Rebecca and Pushpan, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Clancy. Maybe Carmela behind, please.
Good morning. I'm Carmela Fonbuena, Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. This issue is very important also to the Philippines. The Senate has been investigating POGO operations in the Philippines. So my question is, the Philippines has been involved in UNODC work to craft regional policy and regional response. At the same time, senators in the Philippines have been calling for the ban of POGO operations altogether. Is there an argument for banning the operations while there is no effective regional policy and regional response? Because as everyone has mentioned today, the impact, there's been a discussion on the objective of the creation of all these SEZs, but the realities, as we have seen, is very different from the objective. So is there an argument for banning them until an effective strategy is in place? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Usha Daniel. I am part of the IACC Fellows as well as a journalist from Malaysia. I have a question for anyone on the panel. We see that this scam crisis has taken over Malaysia repeatedly. Multiple reports have come out about Malaysian scam victims. My question is, the scam crisis carries a lot of diplomatic crisis for ASEAN per se. What does that actually mean for ASEAN, and how can governments work together to overcome the scam crisis? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to go first?
Something on that.
Rebecca, do you want to
You want me to go
Yeah,
first? Or no, happy to go first. To the first question around, the role of Australia, the role of the EU and others in all of this. A lot of what I've been doing over the last couple of years has actually been traveling to countries and meeting with diplomatic missions, meeting with, government counterparts in Australia and the EU. And to be honest, it's taken a little while for this to come onto the radar and really understand what this crime is about. But I think one of the roles and the conversations we've been having in relation to this, and going to your point, Bor, we need awareness around this. Australian citizens, EU citizens, they are being victimized by this as well. Money flows are going into Australia. High-level criminals are, getting citizenships in certain countries. They're establishing property and, businesses, and they have links to all of our countries. So I think one of the positions that we've been working as UNODC is to help governments understand that and the linkages and the roles that they play. If we just start following the money, I'd be very surprised if there isn't one country that really isn't untouched by all of this. So, I think part of it is that prevention and that narrative and convincing governments that they have a really important role to play. This isn't just through political pressure, for example. For example, in Cambodia, we've been working very closely with all the diplomatic missions there to develop key common talking points that we are all working together, from UNODC to Australia, to the Philippines, to India, where everyone is essentially affected by this, to really have a common message to put forward to the government when we're engaging with the different agencies that we work with, not just in Cambodia and others. Myanmar is a bit more complicated, but that political pressure can certainly have an impact. And we know a lot of countries in Southeast Asia as well, are very concerned about their reputation and how they fit within all of this. To go to the question around the POGOs, I know this is a debate that's occurring in the Philippines. It's a very interesting one. And I know there's really multiple sides to this coin in relation to, law enforcement and others saying we need a full outright ban of this. Like, this just needs to be eradicated from our country. There's no good that's being brought to this. But then you have the agencies who are on the other side and saying, well, no, if it's regulated properly, then we certainly can, have casinos and gambling and, the sort of fun aspect of all of this. And it can bring revenue to the country. So this is quite an interesting debate. I think where things certainly fall down, and this has been a point made by pretty much all the panelists, is the lack of regulation, the lack of understanding of how special economic zones and casinos function, the ability to track, the metaverse and what is occurring in relation to the illegal activities in the space where, unfortunately, governments and law enforcement agencies really lack an understanding. And we have been operating, several steps behind a lot of these organized crime groups, which comes to the comment around, regional cooperation. And, when this issue came to our attention 2 years ago, it really turned a lot of countries in Southeast Asia upside down. You had a country like Cambodia, which was typically an origin country for, migrant labor, for trafficking victims. And suddenly, the first call we got was, the Thai police commissioner saying, I'm getting reports of 300 Thais being trafficked to Cambodia. And my boss rings me up and I'm trying to wrap my head around this in terms of Thais going to Cambodia and being trafficked. So I think it's taken a bit of time, in terms of understanding this, which goes to that sort of diplomatic crisis. And I think, listening to Pushpin and what certain governments are looking at sort of adopting in this, and we know conversations are occurring in Thailand as well in terms of casinos, special economic zones. I mean, I think this awareness in terms of the risks around this, and once you sort of create that opening for organized crime groups to potentially establish a foothold can be very, very concerning. Yep. We know there have been examples of scam operations that have opened up in Malaysia, but they've been quickly shut down. But if they're now given the spaces where then law enforcement and government officials don't feel that they have the same level of regulation or authority to investigate and enforce, then I think we have a lot of problems. So, I think in a way this is a diplomatic crisis in that we need to work regionally. Countries need to communicate each other. They need to share their experiences, and we need to put pressure on each other. This is one of the things UNODC tries to do, but other countries as well. We're stronger as a collective voice if we're going to address this.
Can I just draw on that one to Clancy's point? I mean, the whole thing about sanctions too by countries like Australia, by the US,
Absolutely.
by the EU. I think you're also getting at the pressure points that others can really make. And I think the whole policy thing back home is equally important. And I'm not sure if Pushpin is actually going to get to this point.
Yeah, I just want to touch on the policy. Actually, if SEZs is a very interesting topic, because if you touch on policy, you have to go into the ideology behind it as well. Why I say this? Because in Scotland itself, there is a debate going on there in terms of how SEZs are being used to either corporatize it or to allow free market to play a significant role. And they link it to the idea of a libertarian concept and all that. So looking at policy-wise, you have to link between the ideology of the country and the political positioning in terms of what SEZ is to be. But I think the better framework, as mentioned, is to look at how to create regulations, laws that actually govern how SEZs function. Without that kind of compliance or a framework, then we have a problem. If you're talking about policy-wise, then you have got political intentions, ideological differences. How that fit into a larger framework is a bit more difficult to manage, but I think the framework in terms of managing itself, the SEZ itself is more important. Now, in terms of the question of scandals in Malaysia, it becomes an international scandal issue. I think that is mostly because in Malaysia's experience, there's a lot of interlink between politicians and people in power with key businesses. key grand businesses where grand corruption happens. So in that instance, when there is a conflict, there is influence from these politicians to see how to keep it under wraps. So that's where journalists and people, CSOs like us, need to expose the roles that politicians play in this kind of businesses, in SEZ roles, grand operations, projects. So once we expose those, we are able to control their participation, at least in terms of this kind of major projects. That would be how I would approach that.
Thanks, Pushpin. Bor?
Could I suggest something to Clancy's question? I'm sorry, I know it wasn't directed at me, but it's something that we have sort of very gently touched on that I actually think could be quite useful, especially for Australia, which is kind of in a difficult position, right? Because we talked a lot about the origins of some of these Chinese criminal groups, and there's really difficult in Australia to control that. And one of the things that we mentioned, certainly Pushpan had mentioned, that we haven't talked about in terms of policy, where I actually think Western governments could do a lot more, is looking at the technology and the cyber aspect of it. It's very difficult to police like these cryptocurrency transfers and like the way that these monies are being moved. And the funny thing, we've got a lot more about the Prince Group coming, Clancy, so you and I should definitely talk. But one of the interesting things about the Prince Group is the CEO, the founder, Chenzi, who we talked about, got his start actually as a hacker. And they have a very, so one of the things that's interesting is that they've got a very robust sort of cyber capability end, right? Which you kind of have to do these cryptocurrency and sort of money transfer schemes online. And what Pushpan was alluding to earlier about the sophistication of these kinds of crimes that could happen in the metaverse or what have you. And I actually think governments can do a lot more in terms of understanding cyber policy and global connections and collaboration on how you do this kind of policing, because I know from our reporting, whenever you're speaking to a government entity, oftentimes it feels like, or maybe we just don't know and the NSA's got lots of information, but it often feels like they're a bit on the back foot when it comes to like, okay, how do we collaborate on this, right? So I think cyber is sort of a governance arena that could definitely be explored more, especially as these crimes become more sophisticated and move to arenas that are not so beyond just the physical.
So maybe, unless Dara wants to add anything, we'll go to another round of questions. We've got one here, one there. Okay, 2 questions, please. Oh, 3. Okay. Can we have the microphone just here, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Christina Ammerhaus. I work with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Thanks a lot for this really very interesting panel and discussion. I had a question around the role of special economic zones. So you started out by saying that special economic zones, because they have less supervision, acted sort of as crime magnets across the region. But we've also seen that casinos and scam operations actually proliferated across the region and aren't really limited to special economic zones anymore. So I was wondering how you would evaluate this expansion to also border towns and the capitals of some of the countries of the region. What's actually the role of special economic zones for the scam operations? And also, what does that mean in terms of government or state-embedded actors' involvement? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question here, please.
Hello, good morning. My name is Brigitte Chalebian. I'm a lawyer and director of Justice Without Frontiers organization based in Lebanon. I have a question related to the social media platform. Recently, we have a big scandal in Lebanon, a big case where 300 children were sexually harassed through social media platform and especially TikTok. And there were some people who were very well known, influencers, let's say, who they were using, they were recruiting these children, and children as well, they are recruiting other children. The problem that we have right now is that we don't have this strong mechanism for protection of victims and witnesses. Families are afraid from stigma and other. My question here is, first, there is challenges regarding the investigation. We need the cooperation of the other countries. But what is the role and responsibilities of this social media platform? Is there any responsibilities? There is any protocol that they should follow? Regarding TikTok, for example, there is the age. Of course, there is a role. It should be a role for the national, for the ministries. Ministry of Information or Communication or other, but this is really, we are talking about the cybersecurity, we are talking about the online platform, but what we shall do, what are your suggestions for us to follow as organization, as a jurist in Lebanon? Thank you very much.
Thank you. One last question here, please. If I could ask you to keep it short, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Daiva Repechkaite. I'm currently a fellow with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And my question is mainly to Bor, because I heard you mention fictitious online games, and this is something that I've seen an application for a license in one of the European jurisdictions by two people from different regions coming together and developing some interesting business ideas that have to do with online gambling. So I'm just curious if online games that supposedly do not have any kind of monetary component can be an entry point into new jurisdictions to get licenses to operate gambling operations. And if so, what are the red flags to watch out for, and how can we spot fictitious online games? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So 3 questions around the role of SEZ, social media, and also the fictitious online games. So maybe if we can have a minute and a half each.
Okay,
I'll start with, maybe I can start with Dara, is that okay? And I'll end with you, Pushpin. Oh, sorry.
Actually, I have no idea.
Okay, Dara can go last.
I could take the. Thank you so much for the question. So, in the case of the investigation that we did, the way we found out about the games was that actually a source had told us that these games were being used as a cover and that they're not actually. Like nobody's actually participating in them. I think there is a way, so this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with respect to policy and the cyber aspect of it. There is a way, if you're a cyber professional, you can actually figure out if people are playing these games and where the IPs are being bounced. And there's a specific structure that you can look at to see like, oh, this IP is here, but nobody's actually logging on and playing these hours here. And in the case of the Prince Group investigation that we did, we were told by insiders, and we had seen some documents that these were being used as cover for these remittance agencies to have the excuse to move the money. And I think I wouldn't be able to answer questions about like specific spotting, but we were really lucky to speak to Transparency International, in fact, and got a lot of their guidance on kind of the things that to look out for. With respect to the role of social media, thank you for the question. And I think exactly to your point, this is a problem that's happening all over the world, right? Like, as I mentioned, the teens who were trafficked from Laos, they were these 14, 16-year-old kids who were getting these messages on Facebook and WhatsApp. And again, I just go back to, I think there is both a private and a governance responsibility to see how they're being used.
Thanks, Bor. Dara?
For me, so I think, yes, we need to hold the giant high-tech accountable, so we cannot let them fly away with their gram. So this is very, very horrible. Seems like they have a super powerful, but they use their powerful in the wrong way, so they're gonna mess up with people life. So I think the UNODC and other like also other government very have the power that can hold them accountable. And just move back, I want to add a little one thing like every country mostly about diplomat relations. So I think since the diplomat is not work into that way, we need to do backdoor way. What I mean in this way, like I already mentioned, like since like I arresting a case like a U.S. citizen who report to the police FBI since 2021, and the FBI never alert her so far now. So because the FBI said it is not our jurisdiction, it is in Cambodia jurisdiction or in India, in other. So since they cannot do it, but they can ask the NGO or the private company that located in Cambodia or in Myanmar, file a report, make a lawsuit, go after these people, and then they can trace out the wallet. So I think because like it is good that some giant tech company like Binance and other for it, and so they are also share some information, so it's easy to see the wallet, and then they can chasing the criminal easily. So hopefully after the meeting we come together and find a common ground to hold them accountable, both from the government side and also from the giant tech side too.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Just quickly to add, Christina, your question. You're absolutely right. Like, this isn't all just occurring in special economic zones, and it's not all linked specifically to casinos. I think the key is really understanding that mapping and looking at how this is actually operating in each of those countries. So, you know, what's occurring in Myanmar and the political and you know, the wider situation there is different from it is in Cambodia. It's different from it is in Laos, Malaysia, etc. So I think really understanding how these scam operations are functioning in these countries, who's behind them, where they're located, how they're shifting, is really linked to then how we respond to this, because there isn't just a one response fits all approach to this. We really need to understand the conditions in each of the countries and what's driving this and who's involved, and that can inform our approach. On the social media, absolutely, they have a critical role to play in relation to this. TikTok, Facebook, all of the social media platforms. We have been trying to work with them, and we are working with them in relation to, you know, the scam operations, but also, you know, wider online exploitation of children more broadly. I know, for example, Facebook has a committee in relation to this. I've done some advising on that, but it really is looking at how we can work with them, and they are happy to often engage. There are a lot of challenges, of course, with working with big social media companies in this respect, but you know, we have been successful, for example, of information being shared that has led to successful investigations. Some of these fraudulent ads being taken down, but often that's a lot like playing whack-a-mole, where you take one down and it pops up somewhere else. But absolutely agree with the other ones that we really do need to engage and find ways of working with these big tech companies in that respect.
Pushpin.
Yeah, I just want to echo a little bit about Rebecca's point, is that you're right, you know, it happens everywhere. But I think the issue now is the pressure points. When you have got increased enforcement, increased laws, regulations in open areas, this is where actually prompts them to start finding for locations which they can do their business. I think that pressure is the one that actually pushes them towards SEZs, which is less regulated. The other issue we need to think about is, do we really need SEZ? So many SEZs? Because not many are doing well. Actually, most are not doing well. Very few are only doing well. So the purpose, the intention of an SEZ has to be very clear, and we have to actually ask the government or the private sector, what is the intention, what is the purpose, and how you intend to have benefits for the economy in terms of regional or nationally. It has to be a clear, thought-out process of what that SEZ is intended to do for industry. It cannot be popping out all over the place without any intention, without any purpose, where it actually fuels a lot of criminal activities within those regions. Yeah.
Great. I think that's our session done, Sovereignty for Sale. Please join me in thanking our great panelists. Wishing you a fantastic rest of the IACC, and please come and have a chat with the panelists and network, and let's try and do better because we have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.